On a typical day behind the deadly electric fence, Rick Harrison, once the mastermind behind the antique appraisal counter, stepped out for a meal. Each block of cells had its own outdoor area for strolling around the yard, but no one could have imagined that the man who was once the symbol of the American dream would face such a harsh sentence. Rick Harrison was convicted of money laundering, human trafficking, and collaborating with organized crime. The life sentence without the possibility of parole ended the image of a TV mogul who had been hailed as the embodiment of the American dream. If you once saw Rick Harrison as a symbol of the American dream, does this verdict leave you stunned? Share the video to reveal the truth behind the spotlight. Hit like if you're shocked, comment the number 0 to share your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss more jaw-dropping stories. If you think the story ends with the verdict, you are wrong. Rick Harrison was not sent to a typical prison or rehabilitation facility like most others. He wasn't confined to a standard federal prison with work programs or opportunities for redemption. Instead, he was thrown into what's known as the hell on earth of the U.S. prison system, ADX Florence. This is a maximum security prison that holds the most violent and dangerous prisoners in the country, from terrorists and serial killers to cold-blooded drug lords. ADX Florence is known as the Alcatraz of the Rocky Mountains. This is the most notorious maximum security prison in the United States, possibly one of the harshest in the world. Located in isolation, surrounded by cold desert winds and barren land, it is where the U.S. government holds prisoners considered too dangerous to be managed in the regular prison system. Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, Ramzi Youssef, the 1993 WTC bomber, El Chapo, the Mexican drug lord, and Richard Reed, the shoe bomber, are among those who have been incarcerated there. Inside the thick concrete walls, human interaction is almost impossible. Prisoners are held in solitary confinement, 23 hours a day, with only 1 hour each day to breathe fresh air in a small exercise yard on the roof. Meals are passed through a slot in the door. When Rick was transferred to ADX Florence, he knew he was unlike the other inmates. He wasn't a murderer or a terrorist. He was a fallen businessman. But the prison system doesn't make distinctions. Once labeled high risk, you're locked up with the most dangerous individuals, regardless of your past or reputation. When Rick was transferred to ADX Florence, it felt like a movie. But this wasn't a movie with a happy ending. He was handcuffed, ankles shackled, his head covered, and escorted by an armed security unit. When the steel door slammed shut behind him, Rick knew that from that moment on, he was no longer Rick Harrison. He was just a case number to be managed. Rick Harrison's first day in ADX Florence was an unforgettable psychological shock. Previously, he lived in a luxurious mansion in Las Vegas, drove a sports car, and dined at 5-star restaurants. Now, he faced a cramped 2.1.3.6-meter cell with a low ceiling, no windows, and no sound. The bed was a concrete slab with a thin mattress, the toilet connected to the sink with steel, and the fluorescent light was on 24/7. The smell of mildew mixed with industrial bleach punched into his brain, like living in a giant pressure cooker, damp and suffocating. There was no one to talk to. just the clinking of locks and the cold voice of the intercom system. Rick screamed on his first day, but no one answered. He pounded on the door, begging for a guard, only to hear the cold response, "Get used to it," like a death knell for the world he once knew. The feeling of being stripped of everything, from the right to choose to the right to speak, plunged Rick into a state of psychological chaos. He didn't eat for the first 2 days, vomiting from heat shock and unable to sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he dreamed of being stripped naked before a laughing crowd. Memories of his warm, radiant bedroom in Las Vegas now made him feel suffocated. This place had become the home of his life. His body curled up as if punched in the chest, and worst of all were the neighbors, shadowy figures locked away just one wall apart. Rick's neighbors were notorious criminals, murderers of dozens, bomb makers, and poisoners of communities. He had only ever seen them on the news, but now he slept just meters away from them. Every sound in the night was a low buzz of mania. The giggles, the banging on the walls, and strange mumbled voices singing in the dark, sending chills down his spine. He had no idea if one day one of them might find a way to communicate with him through the prison's underground channels. In those early days, Rick began to understand an unspoken rule that no one teaches you, but everyone has to learn when they're in this place. No one will help you unless there's something in it for them. If you're the only man in the block with nothing to offer, no power, no fame, no alliances, the only thing you have is fear, and that's what makes you the perfect target. Rick realized that the nightmare in prison doesn't start with blood. It starts with the cold stare of the men waiting for you to make your first mistake. In prison, the law isn't what dictates behavior. What matters isn't the official rules, but the unspoken ones. The strong hunt the weak. The most despised, the ones seen as easy targets, are the first to be targeted. Rick Harrison, with his fame, had become a target in this world of superpowered violence. The ecosystem of fame in prison isn't a privilege. It's a trap. It immediately marked him not as someone familiar, but as easy prey for the seasoned prisoners who came and went from the facility like. In prison, there are 3 types of people everyone wants to connect with: the wealthy, the well-informed, and those who can be exploited. Rick checked all 3 boxes, clearly visible to the seasoned inmates. To them, Rick wasn't just a famous man who ended up here. He was a mobile wallet, bait, or worse, someone accused of crimes against human dignity. The trafficking charges made Rick's position especially dangerous. According to a 2022 report from the U.S. Department of Justice, over 40% of prison violence stems from inmates judging each other's crimes. Especially for crimes involving children, sexual offenses, or trafficking, Rick had been exposed by the media and condemned by the public. There was nowhere to hide. In the first week, Rick began to feel the danger. The stares in the cafeteria, the shallow questions about what he was accused of, and the offhand comments, all of them made him realize how vulnerable he had become. A crude warning was etched on the wall near his bed. Every sign pointed to one thing: he was being watched. But the worst part was that he didn't know who was watching or who would strike first. In prison, threats are never direct. Everything is vague, indirect, leaving the weak unsure of where the fear is coming from. A hidden cut in the shower, a casual fall on the metal stairs, a food tray that isn't his. Rick began living in a state of constant vigilance. He ate standing up, with his back to the wall, never letting himself sleep too deeply. He hid his razor behind the soap so no one could steal it. But it was all just instinctive defense. Rick knew he was at the bottom of the prison food chain. Violence in prison wasn't just about stabbing, beating, or killing. It was orchestrated, calculated, sometimes invisible. Every prison has its factions, racial groups, regional alliances, underground mafia ties. Rick didn't belong to any of them. He had no street credibility, no criminal record, no protection from those in power. He was vulnerable, easily manipulated or pressured to join their game. A stranger tried to be friendly, striking up a conversation and offering to help him adjust to the invitation to share a meal. But it never came without strings attached. A folded piece of paper slipped under his pillow with the words, "We know who you are." Every action was part of a psychological war. This was a classic prison tactic. No punches, just sleep. The deprivation, the confusion, the erosion of spirit, and the breaking down of both mind and body would follow. Rick, once the head of a business empire, wasn't naive. But in a place where every action is a display of strength or an acknowledgement of weakness, he knew he had already lost. His new enemies weren't clients on camera. They were predators driven by survival instinct, not societal rules. In this jungle, survival wasn't about charm. It was about how long you could endure before you broke. One night, Rick was ambushed in the bathroom. The injuries weren't severe enough to call for medical help, but they were clear enough to send a message. No accusations, no names, no witnesses. Just a bruised face, scraped skin, and a message as sharp as a knife. This was a challenge, and Rick knew it was only the beginning. 3 mental prisons, nameless fear, the silence that stretched between threats, where cuts were as quiet as knives, and the mind became the battlefield. Rick Harrison's survival in prison wasn't just a physical fight. It was a prolonged imprisonment in his own mind. Every night, insomnia didn't come from the noise, but from the whispers in his head. The fear here had no clear shape. It didn't come from any specific person and didn't announce itself. It crept in through the stairs, through the heavy silence during meals, through the slight shift of personal belongings, through footsteps that paused outside his cell at midnight. Rick had once faced high-stakes negotiations involving millions of dollars, but nothing could have prepared him for the utter helplessness of a place where everyone hid their true intentions. It was the unknown that shattered him. His first sleep became harder to come by. Sleep only came in fragments, always interrupted by anxiety, and he would jerk awake at the slightest sound or simply from the nagging feeling that someone was watching him every night. Rick curled up, his back against the wall, trying to shield himself from the invisible danger in his dreams. He was constantly pursued, stripped bare, not in bloody dreams, but in ones soaked in sweat. The feeling of being hunted never faded, even when no one touched him. Time, once a valuable asset Rick managed in business, had now become an invisible executioner. No phone, no work, no purpose. Each day stretched longer than 24 hours, and a week felt like a month. No visits, no letters. He had no idea what was happening in the world outside. In prison, time doesn't pass. it stagnates, and those trapped inside rot along with it. For someone like Rick, accustomed to constant movement, life became an endless cycle of stillness. In that silence, memories flooded back like dull blades scraping against his mind. He remembered the choices he had made, the shady deals, the times he turned a blind eye to those hurt for profit. The images once pushed aside in the pursuit of legacy now returned as an unrelenting inner challenge. No one needed to remind him that he couldn't forgive himself, for he had become the very person he once pretended not to be when he wasn't in prison. Loneliness took on a different form in prison, being alone among people. Rick was surrounded by others, but no one truly trusted him, understood him, or even wanted anything from him. Every conversation had an agenda, every word was carefully considered, and every silence was a potential threat. Gradually, Rick became more cautious, withdrawing into himself, even wondering if he was losing the ability to connect with others. Even his emotions began to warp. There were days when he woke up feeling completely numb. No fear, no hope, no regret. That numbness was like a real shield, the first sign of mental exhaustion. And that was the most dangerous part. When fear had no name, no shape, and no longer affected the beat of your heart, that's when your mind begins to unravel. According to a report from the NIMH, 64% of inmates experience at least one form of anxiety disorder after 6 months in prison. For those facing immense social pressure and guilt, like Rick, the rate is even higher. Common symptoms include insomnia, paranoia, panic attacks, which gradually progress into severe depression. Rick began experiencing sudden panic attacks. Sometimes just an unfamiliar sound was enough to make him grip the edge of the bed, his tear-filled eyes fixed on the cell door. He began to distrust everyone, even the few who had shown kindness to him. Endless, repetitive questions eroded his ability to think clearly. One time, Rick sat silently for hours, unable to remember why he was in prison. Not because he forgot his crimes, but because his mind had begun to disconnect from reality. It was in that moment he realized he was entering a mental state that no amount of money or fame could save him from, the most terrifying aspect of prison. It wasn't the beatings or the wounds, but the slow erasure of his sense of self. Rick no longer knew who he was. Not a businessman, not a father, not the man on television. Everything that once defined him had been stripped away. Now all that remained was a shadow, a shell of a man living in fear, doubt, and isolation. This nightmare wasn't just limited to the mind. For Rick Harrison, physical deterioration didn't come as an open wound, but bled slowly through the smallest cracks, eroding his organs. The habits and every last piece of stability that once held his identity together had been shattered. Once an active, busy man who was relatively healthy thanks to a demanding work schedule and a structured lifestyle, now he found himself crumbling in ways he never anticipated. Rick began to feel his body weakening in the simplest ways. Shortness of breath, constant headaches, chronic insomnia, and uncontrolled weight loss. Prison wasn't a place to maintain health. The minimal, low-quality meals were poorly balanced, full of carbs and lacking in protein and vegetables, wreaking havoc on his digestive system. Rick's stomach rumbled incessantly, but no one cared enough to diagnose, let alone treat, his condition. The air in prison was thick, with no ventilation, no natural light, and the stench of cleaning chemicals, sweat, mold, blood, and cheap antibiotics. Rick breathed in decay every day. Within just a few months, he developed a persistent, unrelenting cough. According to a report by the Marshall Project, 36% of federal inmates suffer from respiratory issues due to poor hygiene and polluted air, and most never receive proper care. But the decline in his health wasn't the worst part. If this truth shocked you, share the video so more people can know about it. Don't forget to hit like, drop your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss more jaw-dropping stories. His soul had followed, slipping into an emotional paralysis, detached from his own body. When a man loses hope, he stops caring. He skips meals, sitting still for hours. His skin turned gray, his eyes hollow, and small wounds turned red, oozing pus for weeks. When he asked for treatment, the prison clinic simply handed him a handful of common antibiotics. Nothing strong enough to heal, only enough to keep him from dying. The pain became a baseline, no longer sharp or urgent. But the constant joint pain left Rick paralyzed. His limbs ached, his stomach twisted, all blending with the constant buzzing inside his body. But what frightened him the most wasn't the pain. It was the indifference in prison. Complaining was a weakness, and weakness was an invitation. So Rick learned to endure. He stayed silent, gritting his teeth, becoming accustomed to living in a shell that was collapsing more each day. Even worse was the mental deterioration. Now panic attacks occurred more frequently. Sometimes, even the smallest noise, a footstep near the door, would freeze him, curling up in the corner. For 40 minutes, he was too terrified to move, even if someone just passed by. Mental illness in prison is a silent epidemic. A 2021 report from the Sentencing Reform Commission found that nearly 1/3 of federal inmates show signs of mental disorders, but only 12% receive any formal treatment. Rick wasn't one of them. He started talking to himself. At first, it was just muttering in his sleep, then whispering while walking. Eventually, it became full conversations with people who weren't there. This wasn't an act. It was what happens when you live in a world where no one listens. If you don't talk to yourself, you'll go mad from the silence. Rick began calling his son's name in his sleep. One time, he dreamed he was negotiating over an antique, only to wake up drenched in sweat, his heart pounding like a drum. He became extremely sensitive to sound. A faint crack from the neighboring cell could wake him up. A distant laugh in the night could convince him that someone was mocking him. He began avoiding common areas, spending extra time in the bathroom just to avoid eye contact. Every interaction became hollow, and Rick's once recognizable TV persona, once full of life, was now barely holding on. He had lost nearly 15 kilos in 8 months. His muscles had softened, his skin sagged, and his posture hunched as though he had aged a decade. But the outer shell only tells part of the story. Inside, he had begun to accept death slowly. Not by blade, bullet, or noose, but through the gradual decay of his cells. In one moment, in a letter Rick once wrote but never sent, he curled up and wrote, "I don't think I'm human anymore. Every morning I ask myself whether today is worth surviving, and then I live, not because I want to, but because I don't know what else to do. By that point, prison didn't need to torture his body. His mind had already taken command, and no one but Rick could stop what was about to happen next. When identity no longer matters, perhaps the cruelest thing prison does to a person isn't the chains on the wrists or the cold burns of concrete, but how it slowly strips away their sense of self, the only thing that makes someone feel human. Rick Harrison entered prison carrying the weight of a past as a businessman, a public figure, a reality TV icon. But after months of confinement, he had become a shadow, just a number in the federal inmate system. From the very first day, his name was no longer used. The guards only referred to him by his ID number in the system. He was inmate 900476173. A cold, dehumanizing series of actions replaced every status and label he once had. The loss of his name was the most fundamental denial of his identity. It turned someone with a story, a personality, a past into an anonymous entity, solely controlled. No one asked how he felt. No one mentioned who he once was. Gradually, Rick stopped mentioning it himself. The pain didn't erupt. It accumulated like a small wound that never healed. When no one mentioned Rick Harrison, the memory of that man began to fade. The roll calls, the cell phone searches, the staff interviews, each reminded him that he was just another cog in a soulless routine. Eventually, he stopped trying to prove who he was. He began to let go of his name, his image, his legacy. Everything seemed like luxuries no longer suited to this brutal reality. Worse still, the silence made him start to doubt his own memories. Rick began referring to himself by his inmate number in his dreams. No longer standing behind negotiating antiques or protesting, he wore the silver prison jumpsuit, sitting on the steel bench, his eyes hollow. In prison, no one listens to your voice. Every opinion, explanation, and protest is considered non-compliance. Rick had once protested being held in solitary confinement longer than the legal limit. He filed a complaint demanding a hearing, only to be labeled as a troublemaker. After a few more attempts, he understood that speaking out only made things worse, so he selectively stopped, then stopped entirely. He said nothing about himself, didn't argue. Over time, even his inner voice grew quieter, losing its ability to be heard or trusted. Losing the ability to shape reality. When no one asks, listens, or cares about what you have to say, you begin to question the value of language itself. Rick had once wielded influence through his voice, echoing across millions of TVs. Now, no one needed it. His words, whether reasonable or desperate, were ignored. During an incident where he was locked in with a group of aggressive inmates, he tried to explain himself, but they responded, "You talk too much, faker." After that, he learned to stay silent. But the loss of himself didn't just come from how others treated him. It had rotted from within. Rick began to lie to himself just to get through. "I don't need anyone. I deserve this." With nothing left but endurance, these mantras didn't make him feel better, but they helped him survive in prison. Lying to himself wasn't deception, it was survival, and when repeated long enough, even the lies began to feel real. He no longer recognized his own emotions. After hearing that a fellow inmate had committed suicide, Rick simply nodded and turned away. Not out of indifference, but because he no longer knew how to feel. Joy, fear, anger, sadness, all of it had frozen over. No one cared, so he stopped. Inducing emotional numbness wasn't a choice. It was the slow erosion of a man in a place where emotions were considered a weakness. Gradually, he became a different version of himself. No face, no voice, no clear memory, just a shell moving through motions. Wake up, eat, work, sleep. By this point, Rick was no longer Rick Harrison from Pawn Stars. He was just a vague presence, living among a crowd of people who had also forgotten who they once were. The most haunting thing wasn't being forgotten by others, but the moment he could no longer remember who he was. The cruelty of fame in the free world was like that. Fame had carried Rick Harrison further than any other antique dealer. It opened doors that money alone couldn't buy: national television appearances, loyal fans, business credibility, and social status. Millions of people envied him. But in prison, fame wasn't a shield. It was a bright red target on his back, drawing all eyes not in admiration, but in expectation. The fame Rick once held, once took pride in, once capitalized on, had now become a curse. No inmate knew his name more than Rick, but that didn't earn him better food, cleaner blankets, or any leniency from his fellow prisoners. On the contrary, it meant he was watched more closely in every action, every glance, every word. "No way a famous person isn't hiding something," one inmate murmured behind his back. In a place where everything is twisted by suspicion, the name Rick Harrison carried more weight than any sentence. The collective judgment of Rick's past couldn't be buried in prison. It was dragged out every day to torment him. The news articles, the TV reports, had once exposed every dark corner of his career: money laundering, drug trafficking, ties to organized crime. No longer just rumors in prison, but an unappealable social sentence. The official charges didn't matter as much as what the crowd believed. And here, people believed that Rick was the embodiment of a scam artist, a fox disguised as a businessman. The very sins he had once tried to hide or justify had now become the slogans others used to trample him on their way up. "Hey, billionaire," one man scoffed as Rick scrubbed the bathroom floor. "You really trafficked people? Tell us, how old were those kids?" Another shouted during lunch, making sure everyone heard the accusations. No proof needed, just repetition, and before long, they became truth. In prison, the harsh reality was that no one cared what was true. Rick might be innocent of some of the charges, or the media might have reported falsely, but in the closed, hostile world of prison, truth mattered less than emotions. And the prevailing emotion was envy. A man who once had everything was now brought low and criticized for sport. His public image was destroyed, not by the press, but when people exploited it to humiliate him, making themselves feel stronger in the process. Rick tried to resist, attempting to explain that there had been misunderstandings, but all he received was indifference. In prison, no one wanted to listen to a former star talk about justice with them. Rick had stood with the very system that had abandoned them, a society that worshipped money, justified deceit, and punished the weak. When he was arrested, some even called it delayed justice, and they had no intention of missing the chance to land a few symbolic blows. Every day, Rick had to live in a world where his former image was being killed piece by piece. Whispers about his days on TV became jokes. When you once bargained over a $5,000 watch, now you can't trade it for a pack of cigarettes. The ridicule, sometimes subtle, sometimes blunt, had one clear purpose: to extinguish any hope that he was still someone special. Even the guards joined in the mockery. Some would use his real name with a sneer, while others would shout orders during cell checks. "TV star, make sure the floor's clean." No one said it outright, but the truth was clear. Rick was treated more harshly, not because his crimes were worse, but because he had once lived so much higher than everyone else. All of this proves a harsh rule in prison. The past is never forgiven. It is dragged out, torn apart, and used as a weapon against the one who once owned it. Rick Harrison is not only paying for what he did, he is paying for who he once was, and nothing can change that. Not even he can undo it. In his darkest days, Rick didn't pray for freedom. He prayed for a reason to wake up without feeling hopeless. But prison didn't offer many reasons like that. No visits, no letters, no voices from the outside. Maybe the world had forgotten him, or worse, only remembered him for the worst things. Rick no longer told himself, "Things will get better." Rick began to accept that things were only going to get worse, and perhaps he deserved it. The prolonged isolation had pushed him beyond anxiety, plunging him into deep depression. He had stopped reacting to the news from the outside. Once, when a guard mentioned that one of his former associates had received an additional sentence, Rick simply shrugged. Not because he didn't care, but because he no longer felt anything. In prison, he was alive, but he wasn't living. When he looked into the mirror, the face staring back at him felt foreign, not because of age, but because it no longer held any recognizable emotions. When existence loses its meaning, the mind begins to drift toward death, and Rick was no exception. One day, he sat for nearly 4 hours on the edge of his bed, imagining what would happen if he disappeared. The answer would likely be that no one would notice right away, and if they did, it would be a brief conversation over lunch. Then life would go on. The death of a former public figure no longer shocked anyone. It was just another line in the federal reform report. Rick had never tried to commit suicide, at least not intentionally, but he couldn't resist those thoughts. Every time he passed by the second-floor railing, every time he washed the plastic knife in the kitchen, every time he swallowed a headache pill, he imagined, "What if I just—" The scenarios weren't detailed, but they appeared more often, and that was the clearest sign that he no longer saw life as something worth holding on to. When someone stops fearing death, it's not courage. It's that life has stopped offering anything left to lose. When a person is pushed to the brink of suffering, two things can happen. They either completely break, or they start to see something they've never dared to see before. For Rick Harrison, after months of crushing darkness and spiritual death, something began to change. He no longer feared, no longer resisted, but he also stopped denying. This was the beginning of what some people call awakening. At first, it came quietly. A passing comment from another inmate in the yard, a random page turned in the prison library. Then, slowly, fragmented memories of guilt and regret began to connect. Rick started to realize that what he had done, regardless of the reasons, had left a wound in the lives of others. The shady deals, the silent nods, The times he pretended not to see them were not just business tactics. They were the knives he had helped wield. The torment became clear not because he was being punished, but because for the first time, there was no one left to defend him. No lawyer, no fans, no cameras, just Rick, facing his own reflection and asking the painful question, "Am I a bad person?" It was then that Rick began to read, not business manuals or self-help biographies, but books on philosophy, ethics, guilt, and forgiveness. He read Dostoevsky, he read Viktor Frankl, he read the Bible and books on meditation. He didn't read for entertainment. He read to ask himself, can someone who has done so many wrongs still live the rest of their life as a good person? He also began to write, at first just a few lines in a journal, then longer pieces recounting his life, not through the lens of television, but raw and unfiltered. He wrote about his mistakes, his cowardice, the times he should have spoken up but didn't. He wrote to remember, to hold himself accountable, not seeking freedom, but forgiveness from others, victims he and the system he served had hurt. But more importantly, from himself. He had once believed that his choices were just business or for a greater good, but now he saw them for what they truly were. Excuses. Self-forgiveness isn't about erasing the past, it's about having the courage to face it without turning away. So he began writing letters he never intended to send, just pages folded and tucked away in the drawer of his cell. He knew he had hurt people, and he wrote, "I can't ask them to forget, but if they can see the regret in me, maybe they'll believe that I'm no longer the person they once hated." Can Rick ever truly atone? There's no clear answer. Some mistakes are too big to fix, some wounds never heal. But as he's forced to relive every wrong he's ever done, Rick starts to realize that atonement isn't always about being forgiven. Sometimes, it's simply about never causing that kind of pain again, about living each remaining day fully, without excuses, without turning away. And if he still has one last wish, it's not to walk out of that prison. Not because he's stopped dreaming of freedom, but because he's come to understand that what he needs more is peace, whether it's in a cramped cell or in the final days of his life. All he wants is to sleep one night without nightmares, to know that even though he once did wrong, he didn't die numb to it. Rick Harrison was once a man who had it all: wealth, fame, power, and the unshakable belief that he was living the right way. He was the embodiment of the American dream, a man admired by millions as a symbol of sharp intelligence and success. But one day, it all came crashing down, not because someone betrayed him, but because the truth could no longer stay hidden. And when the prison door slammed shut, Rick stepped into a different world, one where everything he once used to define himself no longer meant anything. Prison didn't just strip Rick of his freedom, it stripped him of his identity, layer by layer, crushing every illusion and leaving behind a raw, fragile man haunted by his own past. The walls didn't just block out sunlight, they shut out faith, hope, and any real connection to the outside world. The true horror Rick endured didn't come from the chains. It came from being forced to face the version of himself he had long tried to avoid. The version he denied, buried beneath polished speeches and media appearances. Rick Harrison's story is a harsh reminder. In prison, no one is special. Fame won't save you from your sins. The past can't be erased. And the truth always waits, ready to be dragged into the cold light of isolation. He may still be alive, but is he still human? Leave a comment below, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because there are even more shocking truths to come. This isn't the end.